Here is something that almost no one in psychology or self-help will say to you directly. The people who survived the hardest childhoods are not broken. They're not damaged goods waiting for the right therapist or the right relationship to finally fix them. What they actually are is something far more complicated and far more interesting than the story they've been handed about themselves. What they are is hyper-adapted. And that distinction between broken and hyper-adapted is going to change the entire way you understand yourself by the end of this. Because here is what the self-help industry, the wellness space, and most of clinical psychology get profoundly wrong about people who grew up in genuinely dark environments. They treat the behavioral patterns that emerged from those environments as symptoms, as defects to be corrected, as evidence that something went wrong with the person. But that is not what the research shows. What decades of developmental psychology, neuroscience, and trauma research consistently show is something that should make you stop for a moment. The behavioral patterns that feel most self-destructive in your adult life, the hypervigilance, the emotional shutdown, the compulsive self-reliance, the inability to ask for help, the chronic need to read every room before you enter it, those were not mistakes your nervous system made. Those were solutions, extraordinarily intelligent solutions to environments that would have destroyed a less adaptive mind. The tragedy is not that those solutions exist. The tragedy is that they are still running in a world that no longer requires them, and nobody ever told you how to turn them off. What cognitive psychologists have found after sustained research into individuals who experienced adverse childhood environments is this. The nervous system of a child raised in chronic psychological danger does not develop the way it theoretically should. It develops the way it needs to. It rewires itself around survival, building architecture designed for threat detection, emotional concealment, and rapid adaptation. Not because something went wrong, because the wiring was responding to accurate environmental data. The problem is that that architecture doesn't automatically update when the environment changes. The survival operating system a child built in a dangerous household keeps running that same code into adulthood. And a significant portion of the dysfunction people who survived dark childhoods experience in their relationships, careers, and internal lives is not trauma in the way most people use that word. It is a precision instrument being operated in the wrong environment. The first pattern is emotional fluency without emotional access. People who grew up in psychologically unsafe environments become extraordinarily skilled readers of other people's emotional states. They can detect a mood shift before the other person is consciously aware of it. They notice micro changes in tone, body language, facial tension. They built this skill because in their original environment, reading emotional weather accurately was not a social nicety. It was protective intelligence. But here is what almost nobody talks about. That same person with that extraordinary sensitivity to everyone else's internal world often has almost no access to their own. They can name what you are feeling with uncomfortable accuracy. They frequently cannot name what they themselves are feeling in the present moment. Not because they lack emotional depth. Research shows they have significantly more emotional depth than average, but because in the environment where they developed, their own emotional experience was either dangerous to express, irrelevant to survival, or simply never reflected back to them. Neuroscientist Alan Shore's research on early relational development shows that adverse childhood environments shape the neural architecture through which a person processes their own emotional states. The result is someone who spends enormous cognitive energy managing everyone else's emotional experience while running almost entirely disconnected from their own. Considered perceptive and empathetic by everyone around them, privately having no idea how they actually feel about anything until the feeling has become too large to ignore, and then it arrives not as information, but as a rupture. The reprogramming move: before you scan the room, scan inward. Treat your own internal state as data that is at least as important as the data you automatically collect from everyone around you. Your nervous system has been redirecting your attention outward for years. The work is the redirection back. The second pattern is compulsive self-sufficiency as a survival identity. There is a specific kind of person who finds it genuinely, almost physically painful to ask another person for help. Not because they are proud in the way that word is usually used, but because somewhere in the architecture of their early experience, needing something from another person became associated with vulnerability, and vulnerability became associated with danger. Children who grow up with caregivers who are unreliable, emotionally unavailable, or actively threatening learned a precise lesson: need is a liability. The conclusion the nervous system draws is rational: need less, want less, build the capacity to provide for yourself everything you might otherwise have to ask someone else for. In the original environment, that was the right conclusion, but the nervous system didn't file it under useful when caregivers are unreliable. It filed it under truth about people. And so it runs in adulthood as a global operating principle, applied to partners, colleagues, friends, anyone who attempts proximity. The internal logic becomes, if I don't need you, you can't fail me. The cost is enormous and almost invisible because compulsive self-sufficiency looks like strength from the outside. It is praised, rewarded, and culturally celebrated, which means the armor gets reinforced by the very environment it is hiding from. What attachment research consistently shows is that the human nervous system is a social organ. It requires genuine relational contact to regulate. A person who cannot receive help, cannot ask for what they need, and cannot tolerate genuine dependence is running on emergency reserves indefinitely. The performance of strength becomes the mechanism of depletion.
The reprogramming move is surgical. Identify one specific, low-stakes need you have right now that you would normally meet alone. Ask one person for it, not because you need them to, because your nervous system needs to accumulate evidence that need does not always result in punishment. You are not changing your personality. You are updating a data set that has been running on information that is 20 years out of date. If what you are hearing is naming something you have been carrying quietly, subscribe and leave a comment describing the specific pattern in your own life that this is making visible. Not what you have been told about yourself, but what you have actually lived. The third pattern is mistaking intensity for intimacy. This one is the most dangerous and the least discussed. People who grew up in emotionally volatile environments, homes characterized by unpredictability, crisis cycling, or the particular psychological vertigo of a caregiver who alternated between warmth and threat, develop a neurological association between emotional intensity and emotional connection. Love in the environment where they developed was not steady. It was not quiet. But sometimes, in the reconciliations after ruptures, in the brief warmth after a period of cold, it was electrifying. The nervous system noted the pattern. Intensity equals connection. Calm equals emotional absence. A relationship that feels stable and safe feels, at a neurological level, like nothing is happening. The result in adulthood is a specific and painful pattern. The person finds themselves pulled toward relationships that recreate the emotional architecture of their original environment, not because they are self-destructive, but because the nervous system is seeking what it learned to recognize as home. And home was not peaceful. Home was intense. Research on childhood adversity and neurological development shows that early relational environments literally shape the limbic system, the brain's emotional processing center. The patterns learned there are not preferences. They are not habits that can be broken with willpower. They are wiring. The reprogramming move is this: learn to tolerate the discomfort of safety. For someone whose nervous system was built in an intense environment, calm feels like a problem waiting to happen. Stillness registers as the quiet before something breaks. A partner who is consistently kind without drama feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar reads as wrong. The behavioral work is not to force yourself to feel comfortable. It is to stay. Every day you remain in a genuinely stable environment without manufacturing a crisis or exiting, you are updating the neurological reference for what connection feels like. The update is slow, but it is real. The fourth pattern is a relationship with control that the people around you fundamentally misunderstand. People who grew up in environments where the behavior of others was unpredictable, where safety depended on correctly reading a room, where the wrong move had real consequences, those people did not develop a control problem. They developed a precision tool for managing the one variable that could actually be managed in an uncontrollable environment: themselves. They became planners, preparers. They think 12 steps ahead because their original environment punished anyone who didn't. They manage variables obsessively, not because they need to dominate others, but because for a very long time, failure to manage variables had a cost that a child should never have had to pay. The tragedy is that this tool deploys indiscriminately in adulthood on situations that do not require it. The person who spends 3 hours preparing for a 15-minute conversation, who cannot delegate because delegation requires trusting an outcome they cannot control. Researcher Gabor Mate's work on chronic stress makes a point worth sitting with. The body does not distinguish between hypervigilance required to survive a dangerous childhood and hypervigilance deployed around an adult's work presentation. The physiological cost is identical, and a nervous system that never learned to rest pays that cost indefinitely. The reprogramming move is not to relinquish control, it is to practice the strategic selection of what actually requires your precision and what can tolerate your release. Your original environment required you to manage every variable because the cost of misreading was severe. Your current environment almost certainly does not have those stakes. Begin to sort. Apply your precision where it genuinely matters. Practice conscious release where the cost of imprecision is actually low. Your nervous system will resist. That resistance is not wisdom. It is a very old habit protecting a very old wound. Here is what ties all of this together. The person who survived a dark childhood carries something that most people who grew up in psychologically safe environments genuinely do not have access to. They carry depth, a specific, hard-won understanding of the complexity of human beings, the fragility of emotional safety, the way systems can be simultaneously loving and damaging. They have sat with difficult truths from an age when most people were protected from them. What the research in developmental neuroscience increasingly supports is this: the nervous system built in adversity is not a lesser nervous system, it is a different one, more sensitive in specific dimensions, more alert, more capable of holding complexity, more attuned to the interior lives of others, more familiar with the territory that lies on the other side of what most people would break under. The work, and it is work, is not to undo what that environment built. You cannot undo it, and the attempt is a form of violence against the person who survived what they survived in order to become who they are. The work is to become the conscious operator of the system rather than its unconscious product, to understand the architecture well enough to run it deliberately rather than letting it run you.
The people who do that work do not become ordinary. They become something genuinely rare, a person who has been to the bottom of human experience and come back with a map, who can use that map not just to navigate their own liberation, but to change the trajectory of everyone they are close enough to reach. That is not the story of damage. That is the story of what a mind looks like when it was forged in conditions that should have broken it, and somehow, against everything that environment intended, it didn't.